Probably better. Probably better than backwards. Any other? All right. So, how many of you had a good Christmas and New Year's and everything? Did you decide what to wear to the living room for New Year's Eve? Pajamas. How many of you actually stayed up till midnight? 11 o'clock. It was midnight somewhere. Yeah. I think Diana flipped over to the ball drop for a moment or two, and it was kind of anticlimactic anyway. But we had a good trip to my folks' house. It's a good thing we weren't in Minnesota. We had too many people there. There were 15 of us at one point in time. But we had a great time. I only had to work on one car. It wasn't mine. It was Jeanette's. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about trust. And one of the things that we do at camp, and we've done it for years and years at camp, is we like to do group initiative things. Things where the kids learn to work together, to communicate with each other, to trust each other. And one of the simplest group initiative things that you can do is this thing called the trust fall. Basically, we start with anything that you can climb up on to get you a little bit higher. Picnic table, tree stump, a specially built platform for it, a ladder. It doesn't really matter. You just got to get a little bit higher. And so when you're doing the trust fall, you have the rest of your group lined up here in two lines. And there are variations. Some people like to have you hold of hands. I don't like that one because then it's a more solid thing and it hurts. So we stagger hands. Hand, 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 so on and so forth. Usually about 8 people is how many you would want there. The person up here is the one who's going to be doing the falling. So they have to do what we call bumpers up, which is you go like this, and you go like this, and you roll your hands up here, and then you get really loud. And you do this for a very important reason, because it kind of locks your arms in there. Because I have learned over the years of doing this, and other people have learned over the years of doing this, that if you let someone fall without locking their hands in, the number one instinct is to go like this. And when you hit the person catching you in the nose, they are much more likely to drop you. Now, I have done this with literally hundreds of groups, probably a couple thousand kids by the time it's all said and done, that we do trust falls. And I always, with every single group that I have done this with, I go first. Because I want them to see that if they can catch me, most of the time they can catch anybody else. 200-pound me is a lot harder to catch than 120-pound me was when I first started doing this. But usually the kids are, a lot of times it's junior high age, maybe a little younger than that, and so they're smaller than me. And it's like, if I can convince them that they can catch someone my size, it's easy. So, as I said, I've done this with lots and lots and lots of groups. And I always am the first person. And up until a point, I could say that I had never been dropped. Not one time had they ever dropped me. There were a couple times that my head got a little closer to the ground than my feet, or vice versa, but you can live with that. But not once had they ever dropped me. But one time, about 6 or 7 years ago, we were doing trust fall. And I was on a platform about this high, and they were down there. And I got them set up in their two lines, and I taught them the commands that you have to say. Because you have to say, when you're the person doing it, and you got your bumpers up, and you're turned around backwards, and you got your heels hanging off the edge, and you have to close your eyes, because that makes it scarier. And you got your eyes closed and you're ready to fall, you have to tell them that you are ready to fall, and you say, ready to fall. And they, as a group, are supposed to respond with, fall. And then you say falling, and you keep your body perfectly straight, and you fall over backwards, and they catch you. And it's not really as scary as you think it is, but it's kind of scary. So I had them all prepared. I had them in their lines. I had them set. I got up there. I stood. I turned around. I said, ready to fall, and I heard this kind of wimpy fall come back to me. You really like that command to be much more assertive. But it was kind of fall. And I was an idiot. And I fell. And I will tell you that nobody touched me. Boom. And it hurt. I was 5 or 6 years younger then. I bounced better. So I got up. And I was like, okay. That hurt. So I got them back in their lines. And I got their hands where their hands were supposed to be. And I said, all right, we're going to do this again. And I climbed back on the platform. And I peeked around a lot. You know. Okay. And I said, ready to fall. And they said, fall. And it was much, much more assertive. And I closed my eyes and I fell. And I hit the ground again. I was like, oh. I will say that time I felt some hands scraping my body as I went to the ground. So I got up and I stood there a moment because it hurt. And I was like, I always go first. So I rearranged the children so I had a couple bigger kids in the middle, actually closer to my upper body because that was the part that was hitting the ground the hardest. And I climbed back up on my platform. And I stood there a while because I really didn't trust them. Because twice my body had plunged into the ground. And I was like, I don't think I can take a third one. If it happens a third time, I'm not getting up. We're just going to skip this event and we're going to go do something else. But I finally got myself ready, did bumpers up, turned around. I don't think I closed my eyes that time because I think I wanted to see it coming. And I did my commands, ready to fall, and they said fall, and I said falling, and they caught me. And then we didn't drop anybody else. And, since that day, up to that day, it was easy to go first. And since that day, it's been really, really hard to climb up on that platform and be the very first person that gets caught. Most of the time now I make sure Seth is there, and it's like he just catches me all by himself. Puts me down, and the other kids are like, he's too high, we didn't even get to touch you. And it's all right, I didn't fall. But trust is really, really difficult to have. Especially if in your life you've had some things that kind of made you question that trust. That group of kids, I wasn't ready to trust them to let me do a whole lot after that. Even after they caught me, it's like, well, we ain't doing this again because 1 out of 3 is not acceptable, and I'm not going for 2 out of 4. But we need to trust no matter what life throws at us. We're going to talk about Daniel this morning. Daniel chapter 6. You can all flip there if you want. You probably all know the story. We're just going to go over it. So Daniel was an Israelite, one of God's chosen people from Israel. And we've talked a lot about the Israelites over the time I've been preaching, about how they did what God wanted them to do, and then they didn't. How they quickly forgot the things that God had done, and they turned their back on Him and started to do the things that He told them not to do. started to worship other gods, started to disobey him, and how he would allow an outside conquering country to come in and conquer them and take them over. And this particular time, it was the Medes and the Persians who had conquered Israel. I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and I just listened to one about a battle in Sparta that was actually the Medes and the Persian army fighting the Greeks in Sparta, and it was kind of cool because it was like, I recognized some of these names from the Bible. It was kind of neat that way. But I didn't realize until really that moment of how big of an area that the Medes and the Persians had conquered. They had conquered like everything. To the east and to the west, they got clear up almost to like Italy and Rome and all that. But they had conquered Israel, and when they conquered Israel, they took back a large number of the Israelites as slaves. And they took back some people who were of the nobility, of the finer families from Israel, and they took them back, and we read about some of them in Daniel. Daniel was one of those princes that it talks about they took back. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were also in that group of people that they took back. So Daniel, his life had pretty much been turned upside down. He was in Israel. He was an Israeli. He, was from a finer family, and all of a sudden the Medes and the Persians come in, conquer Israel, and he is drugged from his homeland to Babylon area. And he was taken there. And so his life was probably a little bit unsure at times. If you're hauled away as a prisoner, are you going to be excited about that? Probably not. You're probably going to be like, It turned out pretty good for him because Daniel trusted in God, and Daniel was a great worker, and Daniel had great success during the time that he was in this captivity. And actually, at the part where we're going to read about here, Daniel was finding tremendous success. So the king of Persia decides that he's really tired of doing most of the work of ruling his country, and so he decides he's going to set up 120 satraps, whatever a satrap is, and set them up over all of the areas of his country, and then there are going to be 3 people who are in charge of those 120, and then they will all report to him, and he wants them to make sure that his country runs smoothly, and that everything goes well, and that nothing bad happens, to anything he owns or any of that himself. And so he sets this all up, and Daniel has actually been elevated to the point of he is one of the 3. So you got the king, you got 3, you got 120, and you got everybody else. So Daniel's pretty important there. And actually, Daniel is distinguishing himself through his good work and through his energy and through his belief in God and his trust in God. He's distinguishing himself above everybody else. And the king has plans to make Daniel over everybody else except for the king. And those 120 people and those other 2 people decide that they don't really like that. They kind of like the power they've got. They must have been like our modern day politicians. They kind of like that power, and they wanted to keep it, and they wanted to get more of it. And they didn't like that Daniel, this foreigner, had power over them. So they began to try and come up with a way to get rid of Daniel. And the Bible tells us that they looked at everything he did, trying to find some corruption, some little spot, some little thing that Daniel was doing wrong that they could take to the king and say, you got to get rid of him because he's awful. And they couldn't find anything. There was no corruption. There was nothing in Daniel's life that was bad. So they began to look deeper, and they said, well, maybe we can find some way to use Daniel's belief in God against him, because that seems to be the strongest thing in Daniel's life. The thing that he will not compromise on is his belief in God. So we're going to find something there, and we're going to use that against him. Now, the Medes and the Persians had a legal system that was kind of different. Once something became a law, It was the law, and you couldn't undo it. It was, boom, there's no repealing it, there's no nothing. So they came to the king, and I think they poured it on thick. I think they buttered him up one side and down the other and gave him every sweet word they could give. And they said, King, you're such a great and powerful and mighty and perfect king, and everybody loves you, king. And the king just sat there and soaked it all in. We all like it when people compliment us. We all like it when people kind of soften us up, butter us up a little bit. And the king just really was kind of soaking that in. And he was like, yeah, I am that great. I am that powerful. I am that mighty. I am that perfect. I am. And they said, we think that you're so great as king that you should make it a law that nobody can pray to anybody or any god except for you. And anybody who does so for the next 30 days has to be thrown into the lion's den. And the king was an idiot. And he says, that sounds like a good law. Does that sound like a good law? No, it sounds like a really bad law. But he decided that it sounded like a good law, so he signed his name on it. And as I said, with the Medes and the Persians, once the king's name was signed on a law, it was the law. And it didn't even matter if the king himself came along and said, I don't like that law. It was the law. So then, the bad guys went and observed that every day, 3 times a day, Daniel went to his room. He opened the windows that faced towards Jerusalem, and he knelt down and he prayed to God. Even though he knew that the law said he shouldn't, every single day he went and he knelt down and he prayed to God. And so they went back to the king and they said, hey, remember that law that you signed? That law that said that nobody can ask anybody for anything, nobody can pray to any god or anyone except for you. And the king says, that's the law. I signed it. And they said, okay, we just wanted to check. And then they come dragging in Daniel. And the king was probably a little upset at this point in time because he liked Daniel. He trusted Daniel. He knew that Daniel was a faithful worker. He knew that Daniel was never going to try and do anything to take power or money or anything away from the king. And the king was like, wait a minute, why are you bringing Daniel here? And they said, he broke the law. And I'm sure at that moment in time, the king was probably a little confused. And he's like, well, what law did Daniel break? And they says, he prayed. Man, that's kind of rough. When to say, he prayed is a capital offense that can get you thrown into a lion's den. How many of you have seen the lions at the circus? How many have seen the lion tamer put his head into the mouth of the lion? How many of you want to be the lion tamer? I would imagine that for the most part, at the circus, that's a fairly safe trick. Because they feed their lions a lot. They want to keep them happy. They want to keep them healthy. They want to make sure they're not going, ooh, I need a snack about now. The lions that Daniel was going to get to face were not well fed. As a matter of fact, I will guarantee you that they kept them really hungry and purposely did not feed them because they wanted them to eat the people. But they bring Daniel before the king and they said he broke the law, that he prayed to God. He asked someone else other than you, O great and mighty king, for something. Do you think they really cared if anybody asked for anybody from a god or anyone else other than the king? No. They didn't care. They were just trying to use the king in this situation. So the king, faced with a quandary here, isn't he? The law says that Daniel has to be thrown into the lion's den. But Daniel's his friend. But he obeyed the law. And he took Daniel, and they went to the lion's den, and they opened it up. It's probably some kind of pit with some kind of cover on it, maybe. And they put him down into it, and they closed it up. And they all went back to their homes. The Bible tells us that the king did not sleep well that night, like at all, because he tossed and he turned and he worried about his friend, about his companion Daniel. And early the next morning he got up and he went and he came to the lion's den, and he had him open the lion's den, and he called down into the lion's den. He called, "Daniel." I don't know if he was really expecting a reply or if he was just hopeful. But Daniel answered him. And so they had Daniel come out, and they looked him over, and they checked him out, and he didn't have a scratch on him. Daniel chapter 6, verse 23 says, "The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him." This is the important part. "Because he had trusted in his God." Daniel was brought out because he had trusted in his God. When Daniel went into that lion's den, what do you think he was thinking? I think he was thinking, I am going to get eaten. I hope they get it over with quickly. But God saved him because he trusted in God. Does that mean that every time I trust in God, He's going to protect me from anything and everything? All I have to do is say, I trust in God, and I don't ever have to worry about it. You want to know a secret? Daniel could have been put into the lion's den, and the lions could have eaten him, and he still would have trusted in God to take care of him no matter what. No matter what he faced, he knew it wasn't about that moment. He knew it wasn't about that exact time. He knew that it was a bigger picture. That's why Daniel wasn't scared of that law. That's why Daniel wasn't worried about breaking that particular law, because he knew that his God was more important. And he knew that his relationship with his God was the most important thing. In this situation, Daniel trusted in God, and God chose to protect him. He closed the mouths of the lions. I like to believe that Daniel actually slept better than the king did. I like to believe that Daniel kind of curled up. Maybe he had a lion skin rug. I don't know. But he was at peace in that lion's den because he trusted in God. Now, some might like to say, well, the lions just weren't hungry, so they left him alone. What happens next in the story? Daniel comes out. The guys who tricked the king into making the law went where? In the lion's den. They weren't so lucky. They didn't last nearly as long. The lions were hungry. One of the greatest things about this, though, is the king then signs another edict that says that everybody should worship and fear Daniel's God because he is the true God. The king recognized it. I don't know if he followed his own decree. But we need to trust. My little talk about the trust fall. Sometimes our trust is greatly challenged. You know, they dropped me the first time, and I was like, well, it was bound to happen some point in my life. They dropped me the second time, and it shook me. If they'd have dropped me the third time, the trust fall would have been thrown out of every bit of curriculum that we ever did again in my life. We have to trust God. We have to trust that He knows better than we do. It doesn't always mean He's going to save us from the lions. Sometimes His plan involves us dying. Sometimes His plan involves us suffering. Sometimes His plan involves us facing very difficult things. But we have to get back up. And we have to trust. Because unlike this group of kids who dropped me, God never, ever drops us. We might think He dropped us. Daniel probably wasn't too sure when those doors were closing on the lion's den. It was probably dark at that point in time. I'm sure he had some questions going through his head. But he trusted God that God knew better. And the question is for us, how good are we at trusting God? How good are we at putting our faith in God, saying, God's got this. I don't have to worry about it because God's in control. It's tough. We want to be in control. We want to be at the driver's wheel. We want to make the decisions. We want to do all these things. We want to see things planned out. We want to know what the outcome is. But God says, no, I'm in control. And sometimes you're not going to know what's around the corner. Sometimes you're not going to know where the road's leading you. But follow it. Follow it. Trust in God. And He'll save us. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank You so much for all that You do for us. We thank You that we have examples of people like Daniel who trusted, who were willing to follow You to the end. Help us to be willing to follow along wherever You lead us, to trust You. In Christ's name, amen.